Steven Gaffney, author of the new book, Unconditional Power. The best advice I've ever given, actually, and also received, is the biggest issue in all of our lives is not what people say, it's what they don't say to each other. And the key is to get the unsaid said. If you do that, you can transform your life.
Getting the unsaid said. Wow. So, Stephen, when did you learn this advice? When did this pop up in your life?
Well, I started to do honest communication and just general communication. And I learned the specialty about just be honest. And then I realized it isn't about tone, body language, and all the things you tend to hear. The biggest issue is just what people don't say to each other. How often have you thought, if they had just told me? Or even in the sales world, why didn't the customer just, or potential customer, just tell us what the budget was, or just tell us what the real concerns are? And then we also lose great employees, and we lose friendships, we lose all kinds of things, not because of what we say. It's usually what's not getting said. And if we get that unsaid said, almost anything can be fixed. And we can talk about that as well.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, right? So let's unpack that a little bit before we get to talking about your wonderful book. So how do we do that? How do we get the unsaid said, Stephen?
Well, first of all, we have to realize the biggest reason why people don't speak up. And that's true for us all. And that's fear. Fear of retribution, fear it's going to go on a list, fear that somebody won't forgive us, fear it's going to come out wrong. And so if we make people feel safe, and here's the thing, I believe in emotional safety, not all this stuff about psychological safety. And that may be controversial for some, but my experience having been at this for over 25 years is what stops people is they can know conceptually it's okay to speak up, like nothing bad is going to happen, but they need to feel safe. So the objective is to make people feel safe. And if you think about it, all right, well, what does that translate? Well, have you ever had somebody say, listen, you can tell me anything. Phil, I'm very open to all kinds of anything you got to say. And then you say something to somebody and they flip out. Next time you're thinking, I'm not going there. In fact, I often say to people, we have people who train and condition us to not speak up. We're like, I'm not going there. And the key is to make people feel safe. And then the other thing is to reward honesty. Because if you ever had this experience, I can speak up and I feel safe, but nothing's going to change. It's not worth my time. So we need to reward honesty and make people feel safe.
Wow. Wow. So when you talk about rewards, let's jump into this part of the book because there's a lot here. I want to talk about that, right? Because you actually have in the book, you talk about effective appreciation, and leaders, I think, don't do a great job at rewarding appreciation. They think that they do this every day, and yet when you ask employees, they're like, I don't remember the last time my boss even said thank you, much less actually appreciated me. So talk to us about that, Stephen. What are the ingredients of effective appreciation?
Well, there's two major ingredients, and that's to be specific and results oriented. But I think what we need to do is kind of back up and actually talk about why is appreciation so important. And here's the way I like to phrase it. I've never heard anybody who's left a job because they were appreciated too much. Couldn't stand it. Got to get out of here. Too many people say thank you. And I've never heard anybody getting a divorce because there's too much appreciation. And I never heard of a child growing up dysfunctionally because there's too much appreciation. We suffer not because there's too much, but because there's too little. So why does it happen? It may happen because we think we do it, but quite often people are stingy with their appreciation, or they think, oh, they already know it. Or here's one, I often say, how often do you appreciate your customer? Or how about your boss? And people say, well, I don't want my boss to misinterpret it. But here's the thing, often what we tend to hear is some of the tough stuff, but we forget to say about the appreciation. And then we're worried it may come out wrong, right? It might come out like fake. So that's why it's important to be specific and results oriented. For example, it's a lot different between me saying, Phil, hey, thank you, versus, hey, thanks for helping me out on that report last week. And as a result, we won that new customer. And thank you. It's been great. And it's actually made a huge difference, our service for that customer. So the longer we explain it, the more we explain it, the more the person knows it's real. Appreciation is critical.
Wow. Yeah, specificity and including the results. I mean, how can you not be grateful to receive that information from someone? That doesn't sound like brown nosing at all. That sounds like, oh, wow, they actually paid attention and care about me.
Absolutely. And in fact, the reason why it's in the book, Unconditional Power, is because it's important to send people in the right mindset. The whole premise of the book is when we're in a good mood. Have you ever noticed that when you're in a good mood, when we're in a good mood, we're actually smarter. We actually come up with more ingenious ideas. We approach problems better. And when we're in a down mood or we're in a not the most effective place, you could say it's like, here we go again, another problem. Well, one of the ways to disrupt the pattern of when we're feeling powerless, and we can get into this more, is to actually appreciation. So appreciating ourselves, appreciating others, and actually that whole idea of appreciation can redirect us into a more powerful state, which we can talk about. Hence being powerful.
Yeah, so let's go there in just a sec here because I want to just talk about those benefits of appreciation. And you talked a couple of them there. You talked about the disruption, right? And you talk about how that actually makes people feel. But you've got 5 really specific ones in there, and I just want to go through them just real quick here before we talk about the various powers. So you said intentional disruption. Intentional, I think, being a key there. It recharges and refreshes people. It attracts better things. It validates progress. And then the last one I think is really the most important one, and that is it fortifies against negativity. We're getting bombarded all the time with no, 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 you did that wrong, you screwed this up. So which one, Stephen, do you find is most important? And which one do you think most people maybe appreciate appreciation the most?
Well, I think what you last brought up about fortifying negativity is really critical. And I'll give you a great example of how I learned this. Is from Zamira Jones. And Zamira Jones was the president of ABC Radio out of Chicago. He's actually a really great friend of Willie Jolly's, who's a great friend of mine, and that's how we met. But he would turn around radio stations. And the way he would do that was if the radio station was not doing well, as soon as somebody would do something right, he would highlight that and appreciate. And by doing that, it changes the pattern, the disruption. But what it also does is the more appreciation we feel inside, it fortifies us against negativity. Again, we can't control a lot of things in life, but we can and are 100% responsible for ourselves. So the more we're in the presence of appreciation, the more it fortifies against negativity. It also helps us be more confident and more willing to take risks and a lot of other things that are so critical to our success.
Awesome. Awesome. So great reminder for leaders and salespeople too. Just take the time, be appreciative, specific, and the results makes a whole lot of difference. So with that, go ahead.
I'll give you an example where people don't always think about this. So let's say you're leading a meeting with a few people and you feel people are kind of down or they're super stressed. So you might be quickly, let's get into it. We're short on time. We've got to get right into the problem. But it's important to disrupt the pattern, where the direction of people going in, to put them in a more powerful state, which is a primary point about the book. And so the way you could do that is, all right, before we begin with this problem, which we need to talk about, everybody's got 30 seconds to share what's their biggest accomplishment or what they're really proud of that's happened over the past month. Even though it may be completely unrelated to the problem, by people going into that space, that frame of mind, into the confidence and appreciation, then when they look at the problem, it's so much more doable. But what happens is we go from meeting to meeting to meeting, or conversation to conversation to conversation, and whatever the last mood we experience kind of carries into the current mood. So it's nothing wrong with that as long as it's working. But if it's not, we need to disrupt that pattern, hence intentional disruption that we can use through appreciation. That's an example where people often don't think about it, but it's critical to do that daily in our lives.
And it doesn't take that long. To your point, 30 seconds, think about it, share it. We can change everything in that. If we've got an hour meeting, we've got 5 people to take 2.5 minutes. That seems like a really good investment to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to give you another example of intentional disruption, not exactly with appreciation, but just the same kind of idea. Let's say you needed to be much more creative, right? And we've got to look at a problem and we have to look at it in a different way. What I would do is ask for some shares or with a group and say, who's seen something in their career that was deemed impossible and it became possible? So people will start to share some examples. Not everybody will have it come to mind that easily, but somebody will share an example, which will trigger another example, which will trigger another example. And suddenly we are now believing that the impossible is able to be possible by the example shared. Then when we approach the problem, we're ready to go. But what happens is we just jump right into the problem. So there's all kinds of ways to use this intentional disruption to put ourselves in a powerful state, whether it's appreciation or a form of that.
Awesome. Awesome. That intentional disruption is something we can all learn to do more often. So let's move into the kind of the guts of the book here. Let's talk about unconditional power, Stephen. We've got 3 states of being, which you point out as powerful, conditional, and powerless.
Absolutely.
Can you break those down for us and make some sense of that for us, please?
Absolutely. So there's one state of our being and our mood and spirit, which is we're feeling powerless. And we've all felt that way in life, right? Oh, what difference can I make? I'm only one person here. And it's easy to fall in that trap, especially when it looks like there's a lot of problems coming at us. Another state of being, another mood or mindset is being conditional. And conditional is when we recognize we have power, but it's conditional on other people and other things. Example would be, I can do that, Phil, as long as I get more resources, as long as I have more money, as long as that person cooperates, because I can only do my part, right? It's always as long as. But the desirable state is to be unconditionally powerful. And unconditionally powerful is where we recognize there are conditions, but we are 100% in the driver's seat of what we're going to do about it. So there are legitimate problems, right? Lack of resources, maybe lack of money, time, whatever. But I'm 100% focused on what I'm going to do about it. So powerless is when we're in the back seat of our car. Conditionally powerful, or the conditional state, is we're in the front passenger seat. So where we're saying, oh, can you move here? Can you steer here? Can you do that? But unconditionally powerful is where we're driving our own car. We recognize there's potholes, traffic jams, all kinds of issues, but we're always focused on what we are going to do about it. Well, what I've realized by working with Amazon, Marriott, and all these major organizations on this important distinction, and the payoff has been, is what they've recognized is that most people live in the state of being conditionally powerful. And they aren't even aware that they are that way. They're thinking they're powerful, but they're conditionally powerful. By making them aware and by making ourselves aware, we can start to move in that unconditionally powerful state. So the desirable state is to be unconditionally powerful, not conditionally powerful, where many of us sit in oftentimes in our life.
Yeah. So I like that distinction there. It's a strong distinction. So how do, like, first as a leader, because I know you work with tons of teams, Stephen, how do leaders get there first? Because we have to, right? The speed of the team, speed of the leader. So how do we get in that mindset? How do we get in the driver's seat?
So one of the strategies in the book is to make the unaware aware. We have to, and by people being aware of this distinction, they'll automatically move towards the unconditionally powerful state. And it's a really important distinction because I've learned some things by teaching this, that my clients have taught me how they've used it in ways I didn't even realize it. For example, a lot of the terminology out there is victim and blaming. And so, in fact, I was just talking to someone this morning, and they were saying about how their team and their organization was doing the blame game. And she said, I don't want them to blame, and they need to remember to be accountable. And I said, you can go down that path, but the problem is that blaming is kind of negativity, and it creates blaming back. It's just, and being a victim, it's kind of a slippery slope of what I would call ugliness, and not always in the most productive conversation. But here's the beauty of this distinction that I've learned from my clients. We can self-identify with being powerless. We've all felt that way, right? What difference can I make? I'm only one person here. We can self-identify with being conditionally powerful. I can do that as long as they do this and as long as that. And we can start to see the value of being unconditionally powerful. So we're not blaming anyone. There's not a label that makes us feel ugly. No, I'm not being a victim, and no, I'm not blaming. We're taking ourselves out of that whole frame of mind and using an entirely different distinction that actually helps people self-identify and desire and want to move forward to the unconditionally powerful state. That's an example of how I've learned it, and that's how people have applied it by making the unaware aware.
Okay, so to make the unaware aware, certainly a great step. But what are some of the obstacles, Stephen, that you've seen? Why do some of your clients not get to a state of unconditional power?
Well, a big part, again, is they're not aware of it. And a second thing is that they don't really know what to do about it. We all know to take responsibility for our life, but what do we do with it? So let me give you an example. I've worked with salespeople, I've worked with a lot of executives, and they're looking at a problem and they're thinking, okay, we have to be in a better state of mind. We got to look at this differently. So what I've identified is 3 types of reframe. So there's a strategy in the book called reframe to refocus. And there's a lot of people that talk about reframing, but I've actually reduced it down to 3 kind of frames that really help. One is reduce the frame to make a problem a lot simpler. And in the book, we go through that. We can go through it more. A second way is to expand the frame. An example of expanding the frame would be if you're working with, and you're trying to get business, right? Let's say in sales, and somebody says, well, you're very expensive or whatever the case may be. We can change the wording of it and say, well, it's not a cost, it's investment. But how about this? Say, you're right, we are. And in the bigger picture, though, what I want to say is the savings and the benefit, and you create that bigger picture. Or what often happens in expanding the frame is where departments and areas of organizations have played the police game, right? They're policing other departments. And instead of saying, no, you can't do that, say, well, ultimately tell me what you're trying to achieve. That would be examples of expanding the frame. And the third type of reframe is where you change the frame to a completely different state of mind. You look at things differently. For example, instead of saying, we're going to deal with change, which people tend to not like that word and creates a lot of resistance, why not say evolve? Instead of saying there's a problem, change it to an opportunity. There's a lot of ways to do this, but all kinds of ways, but framing and reframing, which is a big part of the book. There's another part about belief and another part about visualization in a different type of way. So there's all kinds of ways, but I think what happens is that people fall in this trap and they don't know how to get to that unconditionally powerful state. We want to go there, but it's like, how do we get there? And those are examples of how we can actually get there. And what the big part, and what I'm so excited about the book is, we can often be there once we're aware of it. But the book is about how do you get other people in our lives to be unconditionally powerful. So the whole organization moves a lot better and our lives are a lot better.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, Steven, because it's great the leaders there. Right now, we need to empower our team. Now we need to get them there. So how do we move that up the continuum and slide it right?
So when I've been teaching this to a lot of teams, and I work with a lot of executive teams, and they want the whole organization to be that way, I was first say you got to model that. So let's look at the problem. And so one of the ways I end up doing this is I'll share this distinction, and then I'll say, okay, let's choose an existing problem. And let's look at through the frame of, if we're powerless, how would we approach that problem? How would we approach that same problem if we were conditionally powerful? And how would we approach the same problem if we were unconditionally powerful? And by actually having people go down those paths, people start to realize, wait a minute, unconditionally powerful is where I want to go. But they actually start to think of ideas. An example would be, I had a client of mine who had, their folks came in, and some of the folks came in and said, look, we got a problem. And all he said was, all right, where are we on this power continuum? People said, we're being conditionally powerful. And all he said was, how would we look at this operational issue if we were unconditionally powerful? And people said, well, we'd start to do this, and they started offering all kinds of ideas. And he said within about 5 to 10 minutes, the problem was solved. All he did was facilitate by using that distinction. That's an awareness. That's the way people can use this and actually get people moving along those lines.
Wow, that is powerful. That's for sure. That's great. So with that, you've got exercise in the book too, which I really enjoyed. I think that's a great thing to help people really use the unconditional power that they have. So with that, one of them is about building your dream team. And we find in sales and in leadership, right, that our team is really important. And you mentioned how important it is for leaders to model that. I like to say the speed of the team is the speed of the leader. So how do we get building our dream team so that that has that unconditional power that we want? I mean, is it about firing or hiring or molding or shaping, or what is that, Steven?
Well, it's all over, and there's many things you can do. In fact, there's a whole nother content and distinction around creating consistently high achieving teams and things like that. But here's what I would say, just to really simplify it. It kind of goes back to the original message. Perhaps one of the biggest things we don't do in teams and relationships and is just not getting the unsaid said. So how about this? We talked about like modeling it. How about somebody who's clearly the weakest link? Now, I don't mean we got to get rid of that person, but are we addressing the problem? Are we dealing with that issue? It's something I've found out by coaching executives for many, many years, over 25 years. Two things happen whenever we make a personnel move related to our team when somebody's not pulling their weight. However it is, maybe we change their job situation or whatever. But when we make that change, two things always happen. First, nobody ever says, I should have given that person more time. Never. Not in over 25 years has somebody said, you know what? I was too rash. I moved too quick. It's always, I waited too long. The second thing that always happens is always, it's worse than I thought. It's always worse than I thought. And the reason why is because when we ultimately resolve that issue, and it's like lifting up the rock, you see all the other issues that were there that were getting covered up, sometimes intentionally, but quite often unintentionally. So getting the unsaid. So what this means is, if we're talking about being unconditionally powerful and building our dream team, we got to have and handle those kind of conversations. And just so people think, oh, they don't have that, they buy the book, that's great. But here's the thing, I want to offer them something for free right off the top of my head. I wrote a book around the fishes and sick, the water's dirty about how to have difficult conversations, which is an element of getting the unsaid said. They can have that for free. All they have to do is mention your show, and we'll send them that book, which we sell, but I don't want them to have to pay for it. But it's all about having that. So a big part of having a dream team is to deal with the issues that are getting in the way of not being a dream team. Another part is obviously the visualization. What would that dream team look like? And how we construct the members and whatnot, but all kinds of aspects to consider.
Wow. So Steven, remind us of the title of that book so we can make sure and mention that in the show notes and give that to people.
The book for free is The Fish Isn't Sick, The Water's Dirty, but if they call it the Fish Book, we'll know what that is. And they can email it. Just the Fish Book. It's not That's another awesome. Fish book, but it's like The Fish Isn't Sick, The Water's Dirty. It's the idea that we're not sick. Other people are not sick. It's the water, the environment. If we take care of some of the issues, then we feel better moving forward. And it's got 9 strategies on how to do that. And the book that actually we've been referring to, the new book that I'm really excited about, is the Unconditionally Powerful book, because that is, I've seen it transform people's lives, and just really excited to get that out as well.
Awesome. Well, definitely, folks, mention the Fish book, and definitely go get a copy of Unconditional Power, right? Great book, Steven. So if folks want to get started, obviously they should go buy a copy of the book. But what's one more step or one early step people can take to embrace unconditional power, and one more step that they can take to empower their team?
So one of the things, and this kind of builds with a dream team, is to look at input drives output, which is one of the strategies in the book. And the idea is, who are we surrounded by? And there's nothing wrong with that if it's working. But if it's not working and we want to improve our lives and we want to be unconditionally powerful, who in our lives are that way? And how can we actually be surrounded by people like that? So, and this is really, it takes courage, because sometimes we know somebody who's really, we're inspired by. Why not call them up and ask them, hey, could I do a little informational interview with you? Would you mind mentoring? Or can I ask you a few questions? But here's the thing, if we don't like our output, like we're in the feeling conditional or a powerless state, who around us are great examples of being unconditionally powerful, and be around them. This is why team dynamics are so important, because we are a product, our output, how we are, is a product of our input. The books we read, the people we surround ourselves, what we listen to, and all that, our input drives our output. Well, if we don't like our output, we have to change our input. So a lot of this is about, how do we manage our input? How do we deal with that? So we change our output and we're being unconditionally powerful. That's an example, and something that is really important for leaders to acknowledge, because if you allow somebody who's toxic, challenging, and it goes unchecked in the organization, that input will ultimately cause a downward output. But the reverse is true. By making sure we're around good people, and people are great examples, and by changing the input, we change our output. That's another area to look at.
Love that. Well, Steven, congratulations on a great book. Unconditional Power is fantastic. I've read it a couple of times. I really enjoy it. Folks, if you want to get more from Steven, go to StevenGaffney.com. That's StevenGaffney.com. Get a copy of Unconditional Power. Reach out, get a copy of the Fish book. Tell them you saw it on Phil Gerbyshak Show, the Sales Leadership Show, and get to know Steven. Embrace your unconditional power. Surround yourself with some people who already have it, and don't be afraid to say what needs to be said. Get that unsaid said. Steven, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for having me on your show, Phil.
My pleasure.